It's time for us to settle in and get ready for our Bible time and study this morning. If you would, go ahead and you can turn in your workbooks if you have the paper copies to probably around page 90 or so in those printed workbooks. And then we will certainly be in the text of 1 Samuel and referring to some of the passages from 1 Chronicles this morning. Before we get any further, though, let's take a moment and gather our hearts and our minds and our spiritual selves in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the time we share together in study. We thank you for the encouragement that comes through Christ. Please help us as disciples to grow our faith. Help us to learn to listen well to your word and to not only seek answers to our questions from our studies, but to bring our concerns, our fears, and our needs to you in prayer. We offer this prayer in your Son's name. Amen. All right, so as noted, we are continuing in our study. Last week we had a informal pop quiz, if you will, to try to make sure that we were piecing together the larger components of the biblical story that takes us up through the book of Ruth, if you're thinking about it in a timeline sense. And then from that point going forward, we're now going to be dealing with some structural changes in the way that the Bible tells the story. Up till this point, if you were to look back in the methodology by which the Bible was taught, this earlier section was generally referred to as the time period of the patriarchs. That really covers all the way up to a certain degree the initial aspects of the formation of the kingdom of Israel inside of Egypt. But with the close of the conquest and the close of the uplifting stories in Ruth, things change. There's some substantial changes in not only Israel as a nation, Israel as a land, but in the way in which the story is told. And those are important for us because understanding the method of God's prophets and historians helps us understand the message of God's prophets and historians. And so there's some substantial shifts that will help us kind of gather these details together. They will also begin to introduce a larger basket of messianic tidbits, small hints or windows into God's greater theological plan to restore that relationship between mankind and the divine. So with that, we are certainly kind of focusing in to begin with around chapter 8 of 1 Samuel. And what's the big event that kind of sets the stage for this change in narrative and change in style? What's going on right here in 1 Samuel and chapter 8?
Israel demands a king.
Yeah, so they want their version of a king. And what's the phrase that we sometimes think about regarding that? How do we sometimes think about the press for it? And it says this in the text too. We want a king like who?
Like everyone around us.
We want a king just like the nations around us. Now it doesn't say just like in the grammar, but we feel this. We want one of those. They have a king. Why don't we have a king? And what seems to be their desire from this king? What do they want this king to do? Is there any indication in your reading or other pictures of the text of what this king historically is going to provide for them? They want him to go in front of them to war. They want to be the chief captain of fighting. Now, is that how war works when you have a king or a president or a general? Do they do all the fighting for you? It's one of those things that, on the one hand, you look at that's really dumb, because that's not going to work that way. But which nation on earth since that time till now has behaved any differently? Is there an earthly nation that thinks any differently than that? We just want someone else to do it for us. We want to shove the earthly obligations to somebody else. We'll pay them. We'll make them do it. We'll entice them with lots of money and accolades. But we want somebody else to do it. They don't calculate that the somebody else is uniformly their sons and daughters. There's no other answer to that question. And even if you're like, well, some people have enough money that they don't have to send their sons and daughters. Their sons and daughters weren't going to go either way because they have enough money. Like that's not part of this equation. This is a common person. These are the ones who have been rallied to that level of conviction. And so we see this, that this is now a king like all the others. So before we get any further, what do kings in 10th to 8th century BC do? There's a short answer to what kings do.
They take charge of everything and everybody.
Yeah?
They do king things.
Kings do king things. Like, it's a simple answer. Like, what do kings do? Well, take charge of everything and everything else. They abuse their populace. They absorb the wealth from the poorest and the smallest. And eventually, what do kings do on the other end? All the awful things you can think of. If there's an awful thing that has occurred in human history, a king has done so with the imprint of authority in the past. And eventually, historically, how many monarchies, we'll start with those, eventually declare that they have a right to rule because their God, a God, or the God said they should? How many monarchies perfectly always go into this saying of, well, you know, we're just serving. We're servants here. Do they always stay there, or do they go somewhere else? They always go, God says I should be in charge. 100%. And you say, I am so glad we live in America where we have an elected president. How many of your history books pointed out that there was this concept of manifest destiny and the expectation that though we are no longer under the boots of the British Empire, we have a divine right to self-rule. So all we did was put up a paper king with a paper crown, and then every year or so we fight about who's going to be having a handle on part of the crown. But it's a divine right. If you read the Declaration of Independence, if you read the preamble to the Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, and all the other aspects of it, no matter what their religious leaning were, they all end up doing that same thing. So we're no different. We are people just like they are. We are struggling with these same things. So it should be no surprise that when our last judge shows up, he is going to be managing some of these things. And so Samuel would be, in our listing of things, dealing with that. If you remember, the text comes in towards the end of these details. We have the closure events with a theft taking place. And in that theft, the Ark of the Covenant was stolen, 1 Samuel chapter 7. If you return to the Lord with all your hearts and put away your foreign gods from the Ashtaroths or Asherahs among you, and prepare your hearts for the Lord and serve him only, he will deliver you from the hand of your enemies. Their response shifts the story, though. They go back, and then we end up with something else. They gathered at Mizpah. This is in the locations that are part of our spacing here. Mizpah is popping up just right north of Gibeah. This is off of the edge of the Dead Sea. It kind of positions itself in this central power center. The Philistines come in and attack them, and it sets the stage for a perception of peace. Samuel would make his sons judges or determiners in Beersheba, but they are not good people. So that's the backdrop for Saul's arrival. We'll also note historically that the kingdom has actually shrunk a little bit. This is the ebb and flow of things. So when we get to the time frame of Solomon, the land influence is its largest, and its projection of power is its largest, but it shrank in the middle space. So it went from conquest, shrinks in a little bit, it'll pop up under David, it'll further expand after that. So this is the story that gets us to our conclusion of bring us a king. The Israelites really only had one person to blame for the loss of land: themselves. In the covenant, there is an expectation of the blessing of the land is dependent upon their fidelity to God as king. And as such, they simply did not keep the commands. In Deuteronomy, remember this from chapter 7 and verse 2. When the Lord your God delivers them over to you, you shall conquer them and utterly destroy them. You shall make no covenant with them, nor show mercy on them. That's Deuteronomy 7:2. And when the Lord keeps his word with this, we see this outcome. This is part of a larger picture of the complication of the conquest. The Israelites said something different. When they tell their story publicly, they say, we took all the land. We captured it. But they said we took the land because they got the outer edges of it, but the inside was rotten. They left specks, pieces, and bits, often enclaves. And you had another factor that comes in. The Phoenicians come in and settle along the coast. You had Canaanites still existing in the central sections. And in the case of the Canaanites, they eventually became part of Israel. They were absorbed in on the ethnic level, but they never got rid of their religious practices. These Canaanites did not proselytize themselves to God, that is, give up their earlier religions. And we see that in their practices. From an archaeological standpoint, there's a period in the sequence that goes like this: Israel conquest, and there's like all of the major shrines and places of sacrifice of the Canaanite region are squashed. Minor ones up in the hills area kind of stayed in presence, but for the most part, they squashed them. And for a good 50 or 60 year period, there's no new construction. But then they start appearing. I mean, the time of the Judges. They start showing up in archaeology again because they didn't get rid of them. In fact, as we're reading in the story, especially during the middle sections of the history of Israel, this is a constant problem. Constant cycle of reassertion of these idolatrous practices from the inside of Israel. Philistines then are positioned to the south of these things. So in all of the major edges that are to the west of the Jordan River, there is an ongoing presence of idolatrous prior nations just existing inside what would have been the boundaries of Israel. On the other side, you have the Syrians. They settle in that northwestern portion of Mesopotamia. It's on the western upper side. And in time, they would become, in essence, one of the strongest powers in that entire region, eventually overshadowing Israel itself. This is the fear context that kind of centralizes around Israel. And I want you to think through many of your choices in life that are communal, social, national. How often is your choice made in response to a fear? I'm afraid that, so I will do this. I'm afraid that our neighborhood is going down, and maybe I should move. I'm afraid that, and I'll speak to like my own childhood, I'm afraid that the communists are going to drop armies from the sky and they're going to parachute in all across the U.S. because we survived the edge of the nuclear era and that kind of faded down, but the next fear was invasion. And you know, that's when I was a little kid. And so as such, we're going to do this. You just keep moving forward. You can find something to be afraid of, right? You can find something to fear. Well, here we have Israel. They are now inundated, surrounded, and pressed on by idolatrous nations and their practices and their normal presence, and in some cases, more powerful peoples, and they're scared. We need a king. We got to have someone to lead us. Let's do 2 more steps. Go back to Joshua and ask yourself this question. Joshua now leads them. How often is it Joshua who is really pushing the train for them to do exactly what God said? Every time. Even when the other mighty men are involved, Joshua still is there. And in Joshua's departure speech, there's that tension of, will they actually devote? So their emotional need is also validated by their past history. We needed a Joshua to conquest the land, to take the land. Don't we need a Joshua now? Now, do they have one? In essence, they do. They still have a judge. They have Samuel. They'll have prophets that are much in the same role as Joshua. But Joshua was never king. He was a leader and a servant. And he kept himself in check in that regard and submitted to whatever God expected of him. The Israelites cry for a king. They feel like their system of governance is letting them down. They blame God, and so they say, well, we need a king like the other nations. And Israel, in essence, fails because of a lack of faith. Could you imagine the heart of Samuel at this point, as who is serving as the leading voice for God, and they come to him, we want a king? He's like, you have a king. And the text actually implies there's a sense of failure on Samuel's part right there, where he said, this is me. Something that comes in here as you start thinking about what's going on geographically. So here's our big vision of things. We just talked about all of these details of where they are. And so first thinking about where the Phoenicians are located and positioned there. They are going to be placed all the way up in this region. So if you're looking at your map and trying to double check your work here, Phoenicians are all the way up above the little hook on the coast. There at the edges of the Kishon River would eventually become one of the 2 major port locations for Israel throughout antiquity and into the present day. So the Phoenicians, also a seafaring group to a certain degree, settle themselves above the hook on the coastline. Following that, we have our Canaanites that come up. They are then seen pushed off of the center section, but middled there off of the coast. They tend to be presented there. And then our last chunk are going to be our Philistines, identified in the physical map here, Philistia, but they are present in that last lower section. And then as we move to the other side, some of the areas that we've discussed before, we start working our way around the Amalekites and the Moabites that will push in. You're beginning to kind of sense a theme as you see where all of these other powers are in the Israel experience. They're surrounded on every side. Many of these areas are actually positions that should have been held by Israel. They should have been proper Israelite space according to their conquest. And finally, you have Tyre kind of becoming a latter group on the northern side that begins to set up, in their city spaces all the way up to the top. In the middle of this, then, you have what will eventually be the center of power for Israel, Jerusalem. It's not exactly the center of power just yet, because that is going to play out for us in the text itself. But it will eventually become a center point in the kingdom space. So this event takes place physically at Ramah. Ramah is the place where they all gather together and ask Samuel to appoint for them a king. He's obviously distressed, as we've identified before, and he will anoint Saul as king from the tribe of Benjamin. But this will happen with the knowledge of, hey, look, you didn't fail. Samuel, you're not the problem. They're rejecting me in this process and not you. That also will become a theme together as things go forward. So now we have a new Israel. What's one of the terms we use to describe this new phase for Israel? There's a couple of phrases in the Bible, but also in our studies, that we use to talk about this new time frame. Because remember, we had kind of the patriarchs as our prior grouping, but now we have a new chunk of time.
Prophets.
This is the prophets time period in this middle space. And then there's one more thing that we use quite a bit. This is the United Kingdom. And so we talk about this in the terms of, this is when Israel is, let me use this very loosely, united. How united are these tribes? How strong are they with their identity as Israel? They're about as thin as you can imagine. They are Israelites, and when the problem is somebody else, they will play like they're one nation. But they continue to fight amongst each other, with their tribes being a higher priority. We prioritize our tribes over our nation. That will eventually come to a head when we go from the United Kingdom, this is an easy one, to the divided kingdom. All right? Those are all really happening mostly on tribal barrier lines. And eventually that is squashed under the reality of there ain't nobody left. And so the last bit of period of time on the Old Testament side, the Hebrew Bible side, we talk about Israel in a very small sense, and we often refer to them as Judah, which is roughly equivalent to what's left, but not exactly, because there are inhabitants now from all the tribes forced to live together and be banded together in the limited sense. So this is a staging moment, and the first major conflicts of a king doing king things, they are now attacked in the city of Jabesh Gilead up here in the north with the Ammonites. Saul called an army from the coast of Israel in order to solve this problem. Now, you start seeing what's going to have to happen with a king making these earthly choices. Well, the fighting's over here, so we're going to call these people who live all the way down here and have nothing to do on a day-to-day basis with these folks up here. How's it going to make the folks in the south feel when their sons and daughter go to die for somebody else's dirt? Has that feeling changed historically through humanity? It creates the potential for bitterness if there is no understanding of the rationale for the cause. And look, we already know that the faith of Israel ain't what it should be. Because if the faith of Israel was getting closer to the top of its goal, the army would not have necessarily been needed, because God's hand would have been involved as well. So Saul then is providing what they want, but they rejoice in the victory that takes place, and now they think he's a great king because he won. That's going to set a story point for us going forward of thinking about what makes a great king. Saul's a great king. Look at how many people he has slain. Look at how he has defended us. Look at how wonderful he is. Oh, and does he look like a king? Well, according to the text, he's like, oh, he's stately, and he's good looking as a king. He's powerful. And so from an earthly standpoint, everything seems fantastic. But there's another enemy that comes into play. Saul the Philistines. Remember, the Philistines are kind of an amalgamation of peoples who have somewhat migrated, in our cases, we're thinking about it, from the northern western point from Israel, which is sections around Italy and the Mediterranean edges there. Ethnically, they don't look that much different than the Israelites in the sense of their disposition, skin tone, and even language at times throughout history. But their culture is vastly different. It's a mixture of Canaanite religious practices and the varying practices from those upper regions. And so there's not a lot of compatibility spiritually from these groups. This now is the first time in the history of Israel where they produce a standing army. I want you to think back, looking through the law in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, and ask yourself, who is the army of Israel according to that standard? What's the criteria to be a fighter in Israel? There's like two criteria. Male, criteria number 1. What's the second one? It's how old you are. If you're over 20 and you're male, you are fit to draw the sword. That would also imply that if you couldn't draw your sword because of infirmities or other factors, you wouldn't be fighting. But that's not this, right? That's not this case where we have a standing army now to do that job. So that what has taken place as a secondary consequence of the shift from God as king and Israel as all a people, it's Saul as king and he has his army. What happens when you embolden a small percentage of a population with new powers and don't put any checks to stop them from utilizing that power? If Saul is going to do king things, then what are these, we'll call them loosely princes. They're not really from a technical sense. But what these princes are going to do. Princes are going to do princely things. And this is not a Hallmark movie. But that doesn't mean they're going to go find their princess in a slipper. It means that they are going to systematically also create new conquest issues. So he keeps those 3,000. 2,000 accompany him to Michmash at Mount Bethel. 1,000 accompany his son Jonathan to Gibeah. And the Philistines then are attack. Jonathan attacks them back at Geba. The Philistines are angered and they brought their army en masse, all of it, to Michmash. Then Saul calls all the soldiers of Israel to battle. With that, this is a more formidable army and foe than the Amorites were. Things are shifting a little bit. They had punted a small group, but now we've got some problems. Those problems are historically surprising. It's kind of a repeat of things from their past. There's a Philistine army who had iron swords and spears. The Israelites were using, in essence, older technology, bows and slings. Israel is afraid of the mighty Philistines. They began to desert Saul, hiding in caves, thickets, even sprinting across the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. Oh man, so great, we got Saul, he's a king. He's slain so many, he's awesome. He stomped out a small minor skirmish, he's great. Philistines are here. Ooh, they got iron weapons and spears. We haven't even got to the point of talking about a big giant, right? These guys are really powerful. And from a historic standpoint, and from an earthly perspective, these Israelites are accurate. They do not seem to possess the strength of arms, the skill of abilities to survive what is going to take place. And so their behavior is rational. But it's also faithless. For Saul also seems to not have enough faith to inspire courage in those who serve. When the time for sacrifice came and Samuel was not there, he offers the sacrifice, thinking it was more important than full obedience to God. Samuel then rebukes Saul and strips the kingdom from him. You start thinking about how we imagine some of these events playing out from the biblical narratives, and a lot of times we forget the humanity of these events and kind of just disconnect them from what's going on. What do we think the outcome is now? Their leader, who was once great and they loved, doesn't have the kind of faith to actually approach forward to God, and then he offers his own sacrifice. If you had not read the Bible, what do you think is going to happen? What seems reasonable? Those guys have iron weapons, spears, bows and arrows and slings for the Israelite side. Samuel isn't there to offer the sacrifice. Saul's having deserters. It's not complicated, right? They don't seem to be lining up for victory marches pretty soon. And as such, the story points out to us that yes, the people are then defeated. They went on. All right, I found an extra button to identify with. There we go. People are defeated, but Jonathan's faith now begins to manifest, and they help him defeat a small Philistine outpost. And then he and Saul would join forces and chase them to Aijalon. They would on to defeat the Moabites, the children of Edom, kings of Zobah, the Philistines, and the Amalekites. Saul doesn't seem to be trying to take the land as his at this point, but he is trying to push them back out to the boundaries of Israel. But that then manifests in the next problem, because his humility, whatever was present initially, begins to dismiss. And the king starts to do king things. For God sent Saul to take vengeance on the Amalekites, and Saul was instructed in that case to kill everything that was alive. He's victorious, but he didn't follow the instructions. He spared the king and the best of the animals, and that creates a problem. Saul's son would never reign on his throne. His kingdom is rejected. This is 1 Samuel chapter 15, verses 22 through 29. And so now the Philistines are going to come back into play. This highly advanced people who have been pushed out a little bit. God then sends Samuel to Bethlehem to find who will be the new king. And the Philistines then are encamped once again unto battle. The Saul's army is camped there in the valley of Elah. We'll show that in a second. And they both had strong tactical positions in a strategic sense. So it had eventually moved to what we would consider, in essence, a stalemate. This takes place. The Valley of Elah, by the way, is located right along the Elah River. Let's see if I can get this fellow to turn on. It's on. Oh, there it is. So this is located right in this region, and so the Valley of Elah is positioned right about here. The Valley of Elah is, for our pictures, thinking about it, it's a small depression surrounded on two edges. On the edge upon which the Israelites are encamped, it's got a sheerish rock face, and so the upper half of it is kind of just what you would think of kind of the edges of a canyon that have been eroded that way. And then it smooths out and flattens out into lower fertile planting spaces with a stream that goes in the next section. And the Valley of Elah opens up, and the backside where the Philistines are then encamped rises up to a small hill. It's not a very large area. The area that we're talking about in the physical sense here is probably 8 courthouse areas of Noonan. And so that's where this battle takes place. So if you put 8 of those town squares in the city of Noonan, 4 and then 4 again, that's the major section of where all this takes place. And so it's in that area that we encounter our story of David and Goliath. What do we think about Goliath? Let's talk about him for a second in the historical sense. Yeah, we always picture him big. Now keep in mind, is anybody here precisely 5 feet and 4 inches tall? Raise your hand if that's you. Okay, so if you're 5 feet 4 and you take your shoes off and you stand, you represent the average height of an Israelite in the 7th to 5th century. Male. And that's an average Israelite man, 5'4". So that would mean, based on human dispositions and the way in which proportions go, women then would be even shorter than that, and they typically are by a few inches on average. So if you are 5'4" and I walk up next to you at 6'5" and 250 pounds, what's an appropriate term for me? Giant, right? Because I am a full foot and then some, and often could be more than 100 pounds heavier or beyond, 200 pounds in some cases for some really svelte folks almost. And so you start thinking about those comparisons. All right, so if you got an average Israelite at 5'4", someone who's tall might be 5'7". If a 5'7" fella and a 6'5" fella play basketball, and they're even athletes and similar in age, who do you think's going to win? The tall one's got an advantage in basketball every time. And for the most part, in physical conflict, being bigger is a big thing. It gives you increased reach, all those details. Now, what if you're bigger, stronger, and your whole life you have been trained for war? You know, I'm pretty sure that there's no way I could personally beat the very best women basketball players. I'm old, I'm broken, I don't want to jump anymore, and I guarantee you most of them are faster than me. But they're also not taller than me, so it's not going to be this conflict that way, and I'm probably as big as most of the best big ones. Maybe I had a shot, I don't know, but it would certainly be uncommon for me to win. But you start going to, I could probably pick the best player on any college boys basketball team, and 9 times out of 10, that guy's going to win. Now we go into conflict and we start stretching this out. You got a guy who was trained for war all his life. He's bigger than I am, substantially so. And the way he's presented to us in history, note this, all that's shown about what he has isn't about how physically big it is. Dude, he's big, so everything else is going to be big. There's wealth there. The accumulated wealth that is in his hand, and the way that it is described tells you that not only has he trained for war his whole life, not only is he big, he's good at it. He is, in essence, the heavyweight champion in the world. When it comes to one-on-one combat, this guy does not lose. He's big, he's strong, he's mean, he's crass. His taunts regarding Israel are softened in our English translations, and they are crude and rough. They exceed common decency in American culture, but they're fairly common in history, even today, in the way in which warriors speak to one another. And he's saying, in essence, I will punish and pummel you. And then let's talk about David for a second before we get into a little more of the history side of things. What's David's background? What's he been doing all his life? He's a shepherd, taking care of sheep. How many men has he killed? We don't know. Most likely none. He's not a killer. He's not horrible. He hasn't trained for war. But what does he say he's been doing? What has he killed?
Bear, lion.
Yeah, how many of you guys want to go wrestle with a bear right now? Anybody up for it? And not just a little cute fuzzy koala bear that maybe you can outrun, but a wild feral bear. How about a lion? You guys want any of that? Now every guy about age 25, maybe he was 15 to 25, is thinking, I can take him. I can probably take that lion. If I can get on top of him ahead of time, get my hand on that throat, I got a chance. The odds are not in your favor. I don't care how big and strong you are. You do not want to mess with a bear. The best way to survive a bear is to be slightly faster than the other person. And you got a chance. Just knock the leg out. You got a good chance at that point. When David says, I've done that, and it doesn't make sense from an earthly standpoint to think this guy who has been tending sheep has any chance. He doesn't even identify that he is a skilled slinger, which, by the way, is a thing. Because the armies of Israel have always had skilled slingers. And some of them were so skilled that they were known for their capacity to sling well left-handed. That's implying that not only they were super awesome with their right hand with the sling, but they were so good they could hit just as well with their left hand with the sling. I don't know, how many of you guys have tried to use a sling before as a kid? Every man probably has tried once with something. I got my belt together, put a rock in it, and they hit their head with everything. Like it just ends up smacking themselves. And if you haven't done it yet, go ahead, get a little tennis ball out there, a piece of rope, and go out and play this thing like a kid. Because this is what you're seeing, is that there is a perception of, well, this seems to have worked, but we know that the story is, this is the place where David kills Goliath. What is the criteria that Israel has said for being a great king? He kills a lot. He kills the toughest. He protects. And did Saul believe the stories told about himself? Well, wait a minute. What did he think about David when it went from Saul has slain his, but David has slain so much more? He got jealous. Who had made him king? Was it because of his great victories? No, because God had made him king. And who had made David king? God had as well. And at times, David remembered that too. He's like, I'm not killing God's anointed. God made him king until God is done with him. And I'm anointed to be the king after him. All right, we'll pop the pause here. But just to note, in our story, this is the point in which David starts to flip above Samuel. And I'll add this, in the way this story is being told, because we have narratives both in Samuel and in Chronicles, they're not going to be consecutively and historically timelined as this then that in both of these cases. Some of these stories are being retold for us to learn some things about them as kind of like a backstory. And so don't worry so much that, well, this happened earlier and what's going on there. There are some thematic elements there. We'll pause right here. Any last comments or questions here as we close off? We've got a good 50 seconds, and so we'll use it wisely.
Do we have an idea of time frame, like Saul's time frame?
I'm trying to remember our specifics. I want to say that this is starting to look around 1050 BC-ish for the close of Judges. And so we're probably seeing this take place right around the turn of the calendar, counting there to around 950-ish. But I'll double check the answer to that. I'm not 100% concise because I'm pulling that off of my crusty data banks up here. That's it for this morning. We'll be stepping back in here as David rises next Sunday morning. Thanks, everybody.